If there is one thing I've noticed in the last few days is that people really don't know what freedom of speech is. Not only that, but they don't even want to know. Like, I've been correcting people in the comments, explaining why freedom of speech was applicable in this case and not applicable in the other. The difference between protected speech and non-protected speech. Talking about the First Amendment, since, I do live in the United States of freedom, so you've got to bring up the Constitution. But you can explain as much as you want, it doesn't matter, because people only visualize freedom of speech as a single entity. It's one tool. Whatever it means, because they haven't got a clue, it's just something you slap on your opponent's face to win an argument. I thought you were about freedom of speech, say the absolute morons, when we ask for accountability for streamers that do direct incitement for violence. Clearly, an element that isn't protected speech, nor should it ever be, but it doesn't matter. Because you like freedom of speech, and freedom of speech means you can say whatever you want, which I don't want you to be able to say, so I've never been for freedom of speech ever, just to give you an idea of how they think. But because you said you believe it, then now that you don't want this streamer I like to speak, even though he's literally calling for red capitalist blood to fill the streets, then I'm going to slap it to you because it's a gotcha. This is a embarrassing failure of the educational system. I want to say probably their parents at home haven't done a great job at explaining a thing or two. Can't prove it though. Perhaps I'll retract. Not only freedom of speech is beautiful, even in its ugliest moments, it is historic. Now you may think that the achievement of freedom of speech, the ability to be able to speak your mind without fear of government intervention, without fear of government censorship, is a modern thing. As an achievement, particularly in the way it's formed and regarded as sacred in the United States, sure. But the idea to be able to speak to authority without repercussions is ancient. I'll tell you a little bit about ancient Rome when it comes to that. I'll do a little presentation, second part of this video, so keep watching if you're into history. But the reality is that that is a focal point. And I think it's the one thing that people just don't understand. We all know about the exception of the theater. You can't go into a theater full of people and scream that there is a fire and then claim it's your freedom of speech. Why? Because there are consequences to that. Because people are going to panic and they will be injured. They might be dead. So, no. Your speech is not protected. You cannot scream fire in that instance. This is a famous example. I think most of us will agree, as long as your IQ is not single digit. But your IQ is single digit if you think that for whatever reason, claiming to be a supporter of freedom of speech, like I am, means that I'm okay with popular streamers with tens of thousands of people to call for direct threats and incitement for violence. No, you can't do that. That's not protected speech. And you would know if you were actually interested and used a tenth of the time you spend on Reddit and Blue Sky to actually do a little studying. Having established this, I think most of us who are reasonable will understand why you cannot consider protected speech when someone just says, hey, let's go on this street and let's take them all out. I think we can understand that. And for those who don't, just imagine that that's your house, and then you will. But what about the people that have lost their jobs, the mass firings that I've covered on a recent video? Isn't there freedom to be able to speak their mind? I thought they had freedom of speech, but now they lost their job. So where is the freedom of speech there? I thought you were for freedom of speech, people say in the comments, and it's driving me insane. Freedom of speech is your freedom to say what you think without the government putting cuffs on you. That's it. You can say disgusting stuff. The government won't arrest you. That's the extent of it. But if your employer sees it and thinks you're a piece of and they don't want to have anything to do with it, it's a private individual, it is a private business owner, and they can fire you. Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences. Now that could be the same with your friends. Maybe your friends think, you were laughing at Charlie Cook's death? Man, you know what? I thought you were a different person. I don't want to have anything to do with you. Do you think you can tell me, well, but I've got freedom of speech? Yeah, and I have freedom of disassociation. The lack of freedom of speech is a classic marker of a totalitarian regime, including dictatorships. Let me take you back to the European 20th century. I am a very busy individual, meaning that I post on 9 different platforms, not to mention going to the gym, my personal family life, my hobbies. So of course, you can imagine that I have to be very well organized. Having a calendar is a must. I moved on to Google Calendar, and it is good, but the problem is that it can get really overwhelming, particularly when you have to check 5 different spaces and different applications. But to this, there is a solution, and that is the kind sponsor of this video, Akiflow. Akiflow is fantastic because it's a single space which connects everything you have. This, I didn't even need to do it. It just connected to Google Calendar and got all of the information I had. Moreover, it's connected, for example, to my Gmail. So from a single space, I can access my email with a simple click and take care of all the different tasks that I have to do. Time blocking is an effective way to provide structure into your busy life and activities. But this is not the only thing that Akiflow can do for you. Let me expand on that. Akiflow is the all-in-one solution that brings essential productivity tools into a single, streamlined workspace. Fully integrated with Aki, the AI executive assistant. It all starts with a universal inbox. Start an email in Gmail, save a Slack message for later, or capture a link from the web to build a second brain that keeps everything in one place. Akiflow creates one calendar for realistic planning. With time slots, it's easy to organize time block tasks, and reschedule everything effortlessly with support from Aki, the AI executive assistant. Tasks and time slots can be locked to appear across calendars, with customizable privacy levels to keep details hidden and protect time from unwanted interruptions. The Kanban view helps structure each day, week or month, keeping priorities clear to better plan ahead. Akiflow is an ecosystem that understands voice commands and natural language, making task management fast and intuitive. While Aki works proactively to boost productivity, improve daily habits to balance work and life achievements that really matters. With Aki, automation can be created with a simple prompt, as simple as you think about it. Aki organizes automatically all your tasks, assigning existing projects, and offers smart nudges to improve task quality. Finally, Akiflow's daily rituals offer a moment to review daily progress and planning, while productivity stats can reveal trends and insights over time. So make sure to click the link in the description below and check out Akiflow right now. And massive thanks to Akiflow for sponsoring my video. Let me take you back to the European 20th century. What defines totalitarianism? Centralized authority, strength in the military, militarism with resources directed to domestic population, authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, systematic elimination of political opposition by violence, expansionistic foreign policies, and conquest through military might. Already note that all three historical totalitarian regimes of the 20th century fit very neatly within this box: German Nazism, Italian fascism, and Soviet communism. In other words, when we examine the practical manifestations of these 20th century regimes, striking similarities emerge. For instance, the lack of individualism and individual freedom. Benito Mussolini himself publicly stated that fascism is anti-individualistic and accepts the individual only in as far as the interests coincide with those of the state. Number one, centralized authority. Absolutely, all three. Strength in the military. Do I even need to comment that? Militarism with resources directed to domestic population. Authoritarianism and dictatorial rule, repression of freedom of speech. But what about the freedom of speech part? And I will show, well, let me prove it to you. Let's do a little thought exercise. You are in 1940s Germany. You disagree with Adolf Hitler's opinions, so you go to Berlin and in front of the whatever government building that they have there, you say, Hitler was an idiot. Yeah. Do you think you're going to survive that? And into the concentration camps you go. But what about Italian fascism? Well, you go to Rome and you state right in the main plaza, Benito Mussolini was an absolute moron. And there you go, dead in the prison. Well, you probably die before you even reach the prison, but if you do reach the prison, you'll die in there. And once again, let's teleport you to Soviet Russia. You are in front of the Kremlin and you say, Stalin, who is a monster. Gulag, immediate. No freedom of speech. In fact, freedom of speech is the first thing that goes when it comes to totalitarianism. This is a similar situation when I'm live streaming sometimes, or even in the comments. I don't do much in the comments, but when I'm live streaming, sometimes people will come and say horrible, disgusting stuff. And sometimes I'm like, you know what, I'm having a good time. This person is annoying. I'll just block them. And I block them. And then, oh, but I thought you were about freedom of speech. Right. But my YouTube channel is not a public plaza. It still is my private page. So if I don't want to deal with that, I don't have to, particularly because oftentimes it's A-B-U-S-E word. I don't have to put up with that. And mind you, it's annoying because they write in all caps. So At the end of the day, the way I like to explain it is the following. Imagining that it's your house, because somehow people just, unless it's them, they just don't get it. Imagine you're at your house and you've got a guest, but your guest starts to be extremely erratic. And they start insulting your wife, your husband, your son, your daughter. And they go really heavy-handed, like they're going crazy. Then you're going to say, you know what? Leave my property. Get off my property. Can they be, well, but it's my freedom of speech. Yeah. On the freaking street. That's what you would say, right? You can tell them, get out of my house, and you are right. They have to leave, and then if they want to keep doing that, they can do it on public soil. Let me tell you about the ancient Romans. The concept of freedom of speech within the Roman world is rather complex because on one side it appears evident, as you read the sources, that Roman citizens had the ability to speak freely in public. But on the other hand, if we want to look at it from the modern point of view, so a right that would be institutionally protected by the legal system, then we will hit a lot of grey areas within the sources. This is one of the reasons why, if we look at famous historians that debated the concept of whether or not the Romans had freedom of speech, even though you give the same exact sources and passages and verses, they'll interpret them differently, and they will often end up with diametrically opposed conclusions. The reason being ambiguity. So let's see if we can manage to perhaps clear the waters here. Well, whenever we approach the concept of freedom of speech in ancient Rome, the first word in Latin that will come up in the sources is the word contio. The contio, plural contiones, were a form of public assembly more akin to an informal meeting where the magistrates could summon the people to discuss new public policy, new laws, in a sort of plenary session, so to speak. Speaking to the people was a privilege of the magistrates, never a right to the citizen. Only the magistrate who was calling the assembly had the right to address the populace, but as laws and policies were discussed, the people could express their opinions, but it was the magistrate who would tell the people who could speak, when they could speak, and for how long. So even within the topic of these public assemblies, the concept of freedom of speech is rather articulated. Both Titus Livius and Dionysius of Halicarnassus tell us about a massive plenary session or assembly that was called in 446 BC, and this was requested within the city of Rome by two cities within the region of Latium because they were contending over a territory. Now, this is an important session to discuss because we see a contraposition between the two opposites within Roman society, the patricians, so the upper class, and the plebs, so the rest of the people, the common people. And as they are contending in front of the legislators, a man by the name of Publius Scaptius decides to speak in favor of the people. This, of course, upsets the patricians, and the consuls force him not to speak and then want him cast out. In other words, it's one of the first examples of cancel culture and silencing. But Titus Livius tells us that not only, of course, he wanted to speak, but the people wanted to hear him. And as a way to appeal, he goes to the tribunes of the plebs and says that he wants to be able to speak, and they grant it. This might seem to be a simple story, but there is a lot to unpack. Let's see how historians discuss it. According to Andrea Angius, in the book La Repubblica delle Opinioni, he writes, "It appears clear that the right of speech was something you could appeal for, in an equal way for anyone who enjoyed Roman citizenship regardless of their status, and the fact that he was not allowed to speak constituted a violation of the libertas of the citizen." An opposite conclusion instead is brought forth by Valentina Arena. Even if, at first glance, the intervention of the tribunes of the plebs seems to be a case of strong evidence in favor of freedom of speech as a right, the fact that Scaptius had to go to them to be able to speak freely seems to instead declare the very contrary. There was no freedom of speech, and he had to ask permission to speak. So, who got it right? Well, to be able to answer that, we need to dig deeper. Now, all of this is impressive and interesting, and there are many other things we need to do to figure out if the Romans did have freedom of speech. But one thing the Romans didn't have was Black Friday, but luckily you do. And what you might not know is that I offer my own merchandise and my rings with an inscription in classical Latin which reads Custos Veritatis, which means guardian of truth. If you like to defend historical truths based on facts, and you don't care about people who get offended by the truth, then absolutely show it. Get one of my rings and support my work. And because it's Black Friday, you'll get some incredible discounts on my rings, which you will find on the website Viking Jewelry, but also on all of the wonderful things that they offer. And absolutely click the link in the description right now. This is a time-limited offer only for this Black Friday week. A very important thing to say is that as we review Roman legal documents, there is no mention of a legally protected right when it comes to freedom of speech for a Roman citizen. With that being said, we may be able to find an answer to our question as we read Seneca. In the book Controversiae, there are several cases discussed where an individual's ability to speak freely is taken away from them as a form of punishment. In the first case, Seneca tells us about a young, good-looking Roman man who, because of a bet, decided to show himself in public dressed as a woman. As he did that, he was bullied and sexually harassed by 10 men. The story goes on to tell us that he sues them, wins, has them condemned, but he himself had to receive a form of punishment. That is because even though he was a victim of violent assault, the fact that he was dressed as a woman in public was considered indecent. And his punishment, you guessed it, was the loss of the ability to speak publicly. So he lost freedom of speech. The second story or instance that Seneca tells us about is of a Roman man who discovers a traitor. He finds this rich man and suspects that he was guilty of high treason, so in order to prove it, he breaks into the rich man's house, steals some letters and brings them in front of the magistrates as a proof of said rich man's treason. So the rich man is condemned, but the magistrates also punish the man who found the traitor because, he was still a thief in their eyes. How do they punish him? They remove his ability to speak publicly. Freedom of speech is once again removed as a punishment for a crime. These two stories that Seneca chooses are important because they are considered to be extreme cases. That is because these people think or feel that they are victims themselves because they believe that the magistrates weren't being just in removing their ability to speak freely in public. Another similar set of stories that can help us frame the situation correctly within the socio-political strata of ancient Rome and its legislative system are the stories that we read in Quintilius. He tells us in fact of two specific class of people that would lose their freedom of speech and their ability to speak in public, specifically in connection to the contiones. Those Roman citizens who had reached bankruptcy and the children or sons of prostitutes. What all of these stories tell us is that yes, freedom of speech, or the ability to freely speak your mind in public, was something that the people expected to be able to do. But on the other hand, it also tells us that it wasn't legally protected, and there could be situations and instances in which magistrates, or in general, the authorities, could remove this freedom of speech at their will. Now, what we have noticed so far is that even though a certain level of freedom of speech existed in ancient Rome, of course the fact that it wasn't protected by law makes it quite different to the modern concept of freedom of speech. But there is one thing that I think is almost hilariously similar to what happens today in the oratory sphere, particularly when it comes to public speakers. To see what I'm talking about, we just need to go back to 61 BC and look at the altercation in public between Claudius and Cicero, and how these speakers could attack each other in public with very strong words, addressing each other with words such as belva, beast, carniflex, assassin, and maialis, pig. Interesting how politicians never really learn to behave. Some things never change. Alright, number ones, I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for watching. Have a good one. Also, before you go, don't forget to click the link in the description and take advantage of the amazing offer Akiflow has for you. Thank you for watching.